I will be leading off tonight's presentation, and I will be followed by Jason Rasmussen from the Mount Scottney Regional Commission, who's their Director of Planning, and he is going to share some examples and information about what they're doing in the Mount Scottney region. But before I start the presentation, I just want to remind everyone to keep themselves muted when you're not talking. You can put questions in the chat box at any time. I will monitor the chat box and can address most of those questions at the end of the presentations. But if you have a clarifying question or something you need addressed sooner, raise your hand and we will hopefully find you. Okay, and with that, I need to share my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Yeah, we're still seeing the notes. So
You
might
are.
change those display settings again.
I am not seeing the notes, so let's
see it. I see the presentation.
You see the presentation? Do you see notes on the side?
Updating municipal housing regulations. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. How do I'm not seeing that thing at the top now, Jason.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Show small. Maybe I'll escape this one and try again.
Well, we see it anyway. We also see your notes, so however you want to proceed.
I would like to remove them. Let's see. I am not even seeing any tools on this screen. So there we go, escape. Okay, let's try this again. Sharing. And start from the beginning. And now I'm saying the display settings. So there we go. How's that?
Whoa, yay! Success.
All right. Okay, so let's see. Everybody can see that?
Yep. Zoning for great neighborhoods, multi-photos. Yep.
All right, so let's get started. I'm glad that worked. Always these technical issues. So far we've heard a lot about why we need housing through our webinar series. Who needs it? Pretty much everyone, and the role that infrastructure plays in providing housing in our small towns and village centers. Today, you're going to hear more about what you can do through your land use regulations to encourage more housing, where it makes sense and where it works best in your town. Part of what you've previously heard about is that we need a wide variety of housing to meet the needs of today's residents, who are primarily 1- and 2-person households. Part of the solution will be converting larger homes into multifamily units, converting older historic structures such as mill buildings, and creating more mixed-use housing above commercial uses, and also building smaller homes as well. This presentation was originally created by the Congress for New Urbanism, who was hired by the state of Vermont to analyze our regulatory environment and to make recommendations that can work for our communities and make our communities more housing friendly. This presentation was modified by the Windham Regional Commission and the Bennington Regional Commission for use today. What? Wrong way. Okay. So your community first might want to start by understanding your specific needs in your town. We've talked a lot about the need for housing throughout the region, but does your town have specific needs for specific groups, such as young families, young professionals, or older adults? You may already have a good understanding of those needs, and if so, the next question is, Do your town plan and zoning regulations or zoning bylaws encourage the type of housing that you need? If so, why isn't that type of housing being built? You've previously heard about some of the financial considerations and issues related to building housing, but are there things that your towns can do with your land use regulations or otherwise to make it easier to build housing? Then the next step is to think about where you want to target new housing in your town. Think about where your greatest needs are and where the opportunities are for new housing. It may be in your downtown or village center, places where there's infrastructure already in place, where there's services, retail, and transportation readily available. If your town, if your village or center lacks infrastructure, you may want to begin by addressing this need. Neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods in and around our centers are often great places for more housing. There may be opportunities for infill development on large lots or on vacant lots, as well as expanding existing homes and reconfiguring them to meet the needs of today's family. So what can your town do through your land use regulations to promote more housing? These are CNU's recommendations for Vermont towns, and some towns in our region, including Brattleboro, have already begun to implement some of these strategies. Other towns like Willington are looking closely at these recommendations and hope to pursue them with a bylaw modernization grant, which they recently applied for through the state. So you might want to begin by looking at the dimensional requirements in your land use regulations and ask yourself if they're working for your town in the way that you'd like. Density restrictions can be a major limiting factor to new housing, whether it limits conversion of larger homes into multi-units, or it limits infill development, or requires excessively large lots. You may want to start by determining whether or not your regulations allow building that match your surrounding neighborhood. In some communities, zoning requires almost suburban type development standards, even in village centers. For example, front and side setbacks may be too large for a village setting. And you may want even to consider implementing front setback maximums as opposed to minimums as a way to make new development fit in with the existing character of your village center. Parking requirements can be another limiting factor to new housing development. Even though there are folks in every town that I've worked in over the last 30 years who think that there's not enough parking in their town, we actually often require too much parking. You may want to consider eliminating parking requirements where that's appropriate in your centers where there's access to buses. You may want to allow on-street parking to count in your parking requirements for new housing development. And I know that this is an issue in Vermont towns because of snow removal, but there are places, even in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, where they have eliminated parking downtown and in certain neighborhoods. And they certainly get snow in Buffalo. Street standards can also impact new housing development. And you want to make sure that you don't require excessive street widths, especially in centers and adjoining neighborhoods. And you want to consider all users of streets, including bicyclists and pedestrians. If folks can walk to goods and services, there's less need for a car or to use a car for everything. And cars can be expensive. If a family can get by with one car, there are significant savings. All these things can contribute to making housing more affordable. Another strategy is to identify ways to make it easier to develop multifamily housing in and around your existing centers. I just learned that in Oregon, The state is now requiring municipalities to allow certain types of multifamily housing everywhere. All single-family zones must allow duplexes in town centers of a certain size, and in larger towns, they're requiring multifamily, at least 3 and 4 family units in single-family zones. So essentially, there are no longer single-family zones. This was an interesting strategy, I thought, because it takes the burden off communities. It may not happen in Vermont anytime soon, but there are certainly other places in New England that are considering removing single family designations altogether. The missing middle refers to a type of housing that isn't necessarily affordable to folks at the lower income levels, but also folks who cannot afford more expensive homes. And allowing duplexes and 3 and 4 units developments, or 3 or 4 units that can fit into existing homes or neighborhoods can really help to address this need. Accessory dwelling units are another important tool, and they cannot be banned in Vermont as they can be in many other states like Connecticut, but there are still ways that we can make it easier to do. There are things, ways that we can make allowing accessory dwelling units easier to build. We can allow owners to occupy the accessory dwelling units and rent out the principal structure, which in many communities require the opposite of this. Your community might even consider not requiring owners to occupy the property with an accessory dwelling unit at all, or increasing the allowable size of a unit. Accessory dwelling units can really go a long way to allowing folks to stay in their neighborhoods as they age, but no longer need that larger space. Your town may also want to consider making it easier for certain types of development to go through the development review process. If your town really wants to promote certain types of housing, you should consider simplifying the process. Things like reducing conditional uses and discretionary approvals, allowing some projects to be reviewed and approved at the staff level even, and reducing unnecessary requirements. The key is to make it easier to do the right thing, whatever you're trying to promote, whether it be multifamily units or infill development or EDUs. Make it easier to do. And these are these are the options that are presented in this guide that was developed by CNU, Enabling Better Places, zoning, a zoning guide for Vermont neighborhoods. It is available on the state's website, on ACCD's website. Here is the link. It's really a great resource. I hope you'll use it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason and let him share the screen. Let's see. There we go. It's all yours, Jason.
All right. So I hope you are all seeing the screen here, and I'm going to try to get it in presentation mode here. Bear with me. Let's see, where am I going?
Slideshow.
Yes. Why am I not seeing that?
To the right. I know
There we
when
go.
you're looking. Yep.
There we go. From the beginning. Okay, so can everybody see that? And I hope you're not seeing notes, right?
Correct.
All right. Thanks for getting that thing started, Sue. My name is Jason, and as she said, I'm with Mount Escutney Regional Commission, formerly Southern Windsor County Regional Planning. And our slides hopefully there's some similarities. Hopefully it's not too much duplication, but hopefully we're just kind of reinforcing each other a little bit. I'm going to start with, just for a little context, talking a little bit about this Keys to the Valley project that I did with, or that we did with our partners and the other regional planning commissions to the north and east of us. And again, this is something, so Mount Scottney Regional Commission, we're a 10-town region on sort of the south and west side of the map there. Two Rivers, Ottaquechee to the north of us includes White River Junction and Randolph, that area. And then Upper Valley, Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission is on the other side of the river in New Hampshire. And the three of us combined forces to look at our housing needs. And we've done this now, the three of us combined a couple different times over the years. In this particular effort, we were hoping to not be so into the statistics and focus more on what we could actually do to implement. Because we know it's no news to anyone we have a housing problem. And so we were really more focused on what do you do about it. So if you are interested, you're welcome. There's this keystothevalley.com website. There's a lot of information on there. You'll see some of it in the presentation. You're welcome to check it out. If you're from Windham County, it doesn't talk directly to you, but it might have some good information that you might want to take a look at. So again, really quickly for those three regions combined, not including Windham County, we have a housing crisis, and you're probably not too dissimilar. These numbers don't represent Windham County, but in our neck of the woods, we have about 71,000 households in 2020. About a third of those are what we call cost burdens. So they're paying more than 30% of their household income on housing, which is sort of a proxy for affordability problems. So that's an issue we need to deal with. And then we projected that by 2030, you might need in the neighborhood of 10,000 new homes. And so, that's an awful lot. We already have a housing crisis. The cost to build a house is crazy. And we got to build 10,000 more of them. So that just sort of sets the scale of the problem, I hope, for us. I don't want to get too much into this particular project and focus on the details, but I did want to point out that we started this a couple of years ago. The analysis does not include pandemic numbers, and so it's only gotten worse since then.
Should take this downstairs, but I don't want to do it right now. I'm on. I think.
Let's see, there's a little bit of background noise. If people could just remember to mute, that would be great. Okay, so, I was going to say, these are the types of homes in the study that we think that we need, and we think generally this is what people want. When we start talking about affordable housing, people have this image of something they think is terrible, and so we like to start off with some photos of what we think we're talking about here. So this first one in the top left is the Wilson Block in Springfield. Springfield Housing Authority and others recently redeveloped that. There's now 4 commercial units on the bottom floor, 19 dwelling units above. And it's a great example of the excellent work that our housing partners do. And so Paul's on the call here. The Housing Trust does great stuff, but these are not cheap projects. This was multiple millions of dollars, and we recognize if there's 10,000 units that we need, that's likely we're not going to be able to do it all through larger scale projects like that. So like Sue was talking about earlier, we are looking at some of the smaller scale incremental type stuff. So this next picture, this big old farmhouse, that's in Pomfret. That's simply an example of some big old existing house that got carved up into 3 or 4 different units, and you'd never know it driving by on the street. This picture there to the right is just an example of what an accessory dwelling unit could look like. That particular one is somewhere not in Vermont, I don't think, but it used to be a 2-level garage, and they converted it into a nice little accessory dwelling unit. Below that is a tiny house. That's in Claremont. And, when you start looking at the, something like 300, maybe $350 a square foot to build a house these days, smaller might just be the way to go in terms of making it a little bit cheaper. So that's an example. There's a lot of tiny house talk going on. So we can talk a little bit about if there's questions on regulations on that later. Here's a picture of Vermod, a custom Vermod house. They're a company out of the Hartford area, and again, smaller might be a little bit cheaper. So this is another option, and a lot of our towns are talking about aging in place, and there's not an awful lot of smaller homes that are one level, and efficient, and so this sort of a thing might suit that type, or first-time home buyers. And then this last picture is I believe that's Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust. That's a triplex in Brattleboro, if I'm not mistaken. So, and these are just the types of homes that we think make some sense, and there's some other things like home sharing, some co-housing. There are a few other things that also might have some interest in meeting the need of the region. Okay, so why regulatory reform? Many of you might have been reading about this in the news. There's an awful lot of press recently about how bad single family zoning is and so forth. And so here's just a few on the right hand side, a few examples of some of that media coverage over the years. And regulations do often contribute to the problem. Often there are unnecessary steps or public hearing processes and other things that delay the process, add to costs, add to the uncertainty of an outcome for developers, and that's not necessarily good. Sue was talking about it earlier, but frequently the dimensional and density standards are not really based on the existing conditions. They might be kind of more suburban often, and often you couldn't build the village the way it is now if you were to start all over again from scratch with your zoning. So again, they really need to be modernized to get a better handle on existing conditions, make sure setbacks and all that makes sense. Parking, Sue talked about that. That's certainly very problematic in our downtown areas generally. And there's no great solutions to it, but we recognize that appeals, the NIMBY factor is a real problem. And there's a few things maybe you could do about it, but it is what it is. It definitely can cause some issues with this. We're not going to really probably talk about the other regulatory stuff, Act 250, state wastewater permits, building codes, energy codes. Those sorts of things all play into this, but we're sticking tonight on our local zoning bylaws. So how do you get started? The CNU at the zoning link that Sue provided has a form like this, a matrix. And then Keys to the Valley has another matrix, actually two versions of it. Something like this might help you get started. We have the Keys project has what we call a rapid assessment, and there's also a more detailed assessment. And our hope is that smaller towns or a planning commission member who just wants to take a look at their regs and audit it themselves could use the rapid assessment and kind of go through the bullets and just sort of see how their regs stack up. And that might give you an idea of whether or not you're, have some issues that you want to think about or not. So that's a good place to start in terms of the zoning piece. And Sue mentioned this, but I guess I'll reiterate that, zoning is, the town plan is important. zoning is really one tool to implement your town plan. And so it's really best to start with the town plan. That's really where you should, look at the data, do your analysis, figure out what is the need in your community, and what are the goals for your community. What do you really need to do to tackle your housing issues? And that really kind of, hopefully you lay that out in the town plan very clearly. The zoning then follows and can implement that. And the Vermont Housing Finance Authority has a good reference if you want to Google VHFA, or I think it's vermonthousingdata.org. They have a really good reference on how to do a housing needs assessment. So you could look that up if you want, or you could call Sue or me. We can lead you to that if that's of interest. Okay, so some of this Sue talked about. Hopefully I don't get too much in the middle of it. So she was talking about the missing middle. Here's another graphic that's not very Vermont, but there you go. It's trying to get a sense of, we have an awful lot of single family houses, and we have an awful lot of larger apartments, but we don't have an awful lot of the duplexes and the cottage courts or townhouses and some of these other types of homes that might be smaller, more dense, maybe a little more affordable. So when you look at your zoning, I would suggest you look at allowing for more and maybe some different housing types. We tend to have bylaws that have single family houses, duplexes, and multifamily, and that's it. You might want to think about specifically allowing for a triplex or a quad, fourplex, particularly in the villages. You might want to consider other things. So maybe your community thinks row houses or live work units or these bungalow courts or co-housing or any number of other types of housing that are out there. It might be worth specifically including in your zoning use tables. Again, kind of reiterating, but try to think about how can you simplify the review process so that people aren't unnecessarily going through public hearings and conditional use hearings. And I've heard from a number of development review board people that get frustrated when they have sometimes duplexes going through conditional use review and they're asking them all these standards that just don't apply. So don't make them go through that step. And again, duplexes should be a much simpler review process, in my opinion. Mixed use buildings, there are some other, you may want to allow for more than one principal use on a lot within villages. That might be one way to make that happen better or easier. And adaptive reuse is another good tool. Frequently it's for historic buildings, but I don't think it has to be. For example, in Windsor on North Main Street, there's an awful lot of old carriage houses out back behind the homes. And really it's a perfect place to maybe renovate some of those and have some apartments back in there. Sue talked a lot about accessory dwelling units. That's the ADU here being mentioned. So I won't get into that too much. But I will say you might even want to think about exempting certain things. I've not seen this done, but why not? You might want to consider exempting converting some existing structure, say a garage, into an ADU. You might want to think about things like that. Maybe you don't, but that's one option that's out there as well. Okay, so this is an example from CNU of what perhaps a land use, a table might look like in your zoning bylaws. So again, it's getting away from the single family, two family, multi-family thing. So it's got a lot more specificity. Family is sort of a term of art that is going away. You're probably better talking about households or units instead of families, because many people living in a house aren't a family necessarily in the traditional sense. So, so you're seeing they're using single household building, 2 household building. But what's interesting to me is they're adding in the 3 household, 4 household type structures, even hotels. There, all of that under the permission. It may not be clear to you. So under permission, the C stands for conditional use review, and the P is permitted use. So if you're not familiar with that, permitted use is the quick and easy, relatively easy zoning permit. You go to your zoning administrator and they generally issue the permit fairly quickly. There's no public hearing. Conditional use review, there's a public hearing, there's a notice period, 15 days. The neighbors show up and, you know, say their piece and all that kind of stuff. And so the permitted use review is a lot faster and a lot easier. And so in a downtown, like in the picture shown here, you know, you would expect that there's going to be multi-use buildings. The single family house type situation is sort of unexpected in those parts of town. So that's why you're seeing a single family house as a conditional use review, and you're seeing everything else going through a quick and easy zoning permit process. Again, this is not a one size fits all kind of thing. But just want to throw that out there as one option of how to possibly reconsider the land use tables in your zoning districts. Okay, so dimensional standards. At the bottom here is a picture on the left of historic way back in time, and to the right, fairly recently in Perkinsville. And this is just an example of a part. There's many places in Vermont like this, but they happen to have zoning right now that is 1 acre minimum lot size. And, you know, more than half of the lots are non-compliant. You know, many of them are, you know, 4/10 of an acre, half an acre, 6/10 of an acre, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And by having those standards, it makes it hard. Most of the buildings are non-conforming, and many of them cannot have additions, or this big white building here in the bottom. If they wanted to convert the second floor into apartment, maybe they need a stairs to access the apartment. They don't have the room maybe to do that. And so think about those dimensional standards in terms of those existing conditions and set the setbacks and all those sorts of standards based on some reality, or require or allow for some waiver provisions that make that kind of thing more possible. So let's see what I miss. Where there's water and sewer, you know, you might want to eliminate lot requirements, minimum lot sizes, those sorts of things. That's generally speaking where housing can go, and it's a little, you know, more cost effective in that part of town. You might want to think about, well, Sue talked about maximum setbacks or 0 lot line setbacks. So you might want to allow for some flexibility in some of those standards to allow for, again, what's on the ground today. Some towns don't like this because we don't have a ladder truck for fire protection or whatever, but you know, you consider allowing for taller structures when possible. Going up, so it really helps. Sometimes, you know, a project won't make financial sense unless they can get more units in it. And instead of some 35 height standard, you know, maybe you want to just regulate by story. So 3 stories instead of something like that. Makes it a lot easier to understand. A lot of what we're talking about with this stuff, we're really focusing on our village centers and our downtowns, in part because that's where water and sewer is, or we want it to be. But in the more rural parts of town, you know, it's probably things more like duplexes and accessory dwelling units and mobile homes, etc. But one thing you might want to think about is going to a density provision instead of a lot size. I think you can potentially carve out a smaller lot that's a little cheaper to buy instead of 10 acres or something like that otherwise, and it might carve up the forest land a bit less. So it's just something to think about. Here's an example. So if the part of town you're thinking about looks something like in this picture, maybe dimensional standards, something like this would make some sense. You're noticing that there is no minimum lot size, for example. They're regulating by lot widths and things like that instead of a lot size. And in many cases, there's nowhere to subdivide. So, why worry about that, right? I think what's more important is not having like 30-foot front setbacks when, if this is where you're talking, it's like 2 feet, 5 feet at the maximum. So again, just make sure those standards really are grounded in what's on the, what's out there right now. And if you're relatively, certainly call your regional planning commission for help or something, but if you're trying to just kind of think through whether your standards make sense or not, there are some tools like the A&R has this natural resource atlas. It's an online mapping tool. Something like that, it's really easy to get on there and zoom into your village, and you can literally measure lot coverage or setbacks, or, it's not perfect, but you get a pretty good sense whether your existing regs are within the ballpark or not. Okay, so transportation and parking, mostly parking, in downtowns in particular, parking standards really are not good. They're problematic in a lot of ways. Largely, they're more of a suburban type parking standard. And so they tend to be more like a strip mall type scenario in terms of the amounts of parking that they want. And it's really generally contrary to what most town plans are saying they want to have happen in their village center. So here's a schematic that's in our draft regional plan. It's showing parking, on-street parking. It's showing parking behind the buildings, and it's even showing some connections between buildings where you can basically drive between the 2 parking lots. And those sorts of concepts might make a lot of sense in a lot of places. So you might want to think about having standards that sort of make that happen. I think the big thing is, Sue talked about this, so I won't dwell on it, but in the downtowns or larger village centers, you might want to just remove parking standards completely for that part of town. If that's too drastic, you might want to at least reduce it, or allow for some flexibility where on-street parking or transit or something like that is enabled. They might be able to have a long-term lease with the guy down the road and have parking over there. Or in the case of, you got offices on the first floor, apartments above, maybe you allow for a reduction of the total number of parking because, the offices are full during the day, the apartments are full at night. Maybe you can cut your parking in a third or something like that as a result. Okay, so this is maybe what it could look like. Again, just some sample language for you to think about. If your part of town looks something like this picture, like this big red brick building, they probably have maybe 4 to 5 parking spaces on site off street. And there's probably something, I don't know exactly, but there could be something like 8 or more units in that building. So, the typical parking standard just would not work. And so, again, you might want to, as it says, on-site parking spaces are not required. Or there's these this table which is optional, where maybe you have a reduced set of standards for that part of town. And this is my last slide, but I guess if you do nothing else, think about these things. Reducing those parking requirements in your downtown type village center areas. Allow for larger accessory dwelling units. And I will note that statute changed not too long ago So in state law, it talks about accessory dwelling units shall not exceed 30% of the principal structure or 900 square feet, whichever is greater. So I think that's a step in a pretty good direction, actually. So if your bylaws don't reference that, they probably should get updated, and that would allow for quite a bit larger ADUs in many cases. And finally, yeah, think about how the permitting process for different types of housing in those downtowns, the village centers, and those surrounding neighborhoods could be done by right. In other words, as a permitted use, as opposed to going through a public hearing. And that is my last slide, so I'll stop sharing. Sue, do we have questions? I think there's a couple things in the chat.
So the only things that we have in the chat are the housing data tool, which Sarah Lang nicely shared with us. But let me see. Let's ask, do we have any other questions from anyone about how this might work in your town? Yes, Anne.
I have a question. You started out talking about the study that you had done among these large number of towns, looking at a regional analysis. Could you just give us an overview of how that project has been proceeding, what you're running up against? It's hard building housing, but where are you in the process? I'd be very curious to hear more of your story.
So we intentionally involved quite a few folks when we were working on the project. So, we wanted, the hospital people there, we wanted builders, we wanted housing providers, bankers. So we tried to get broad participation, and I think the project was a lot better because of that. So I think that went well. Building housing's hard and it's expensive. So I think we've been successful in getting people talking about it. Many people were talking about it anyway, but I think people are talking about it in some of the ways that we were framing the issue. One thing that is happening where people are seeing the 10,000 new units number, and developers are coming into, say, Lebanon, and they're like, we need 10,000 new units, so my project should get a easy stamp yes. And but what they're not necessarily keying in on is the need. So they're providing, they have a proposal for housing, but they tend to be like three bedroom type apartments, or higher end, higher cost, 2,000, 2,200 monthly rent figures or something like this. And that's not really what we need. So there's a little bit of that going on, I think, at this point. But hopefully it's helpful. So there's some discussion about some legislative changes. The funding in Vermont through this bylaws and modernization has been great. There's been 4 of our towns applying for that. So hopefully we'll get some regulatory fixes out there. But it's still an uphill battle. It's very, very expensive to build these things. So some of the ARPA funds and some of this other stuff has also been very helpful, but it's if it's $350 a square foot, you need an awful lot of money to make a meaningful dent in the need.
Jason, there's a question also about tiny houses and tiny house villages in rural areas. Someone would just like to know more about that.
Sure. So our New Hampshire folks seemed to have more issues with the size of the house not meeting building code. I've not heard that on the Vermont side of things so much. I don't think that's a major issue. What I'm generally hearing more about is many tiny houses on wheels. How do you deal with that? A lot of towns' bylaws are silent on that. And so as a result, you either treat them like a recreational vehicle, so you can't really live in it permanently, or maybe it's a mobile home. So it would be good, I think, to be more explicit, include some tiny house language in your zoning about how that would work, how that could be permitted, where it could go, etc. I think oftentimes it's a tiny house on wheels that somebody wants as an accessory dwelling, and whether that's allowed or not, because it's not a permanent foundation. It's something to think about. And I also think tiny house villages are a really good idea. There are places in, for example, Syracuse, where they have tiny houses that are being used for homeless folks. So they're building tiny houses and they're finding homes for homeless or people at risk of being homeless. Or, there's other places where tiny house village is basically a mobile home park. But some people want that. And there are parts like Oregon where that's happening more than it is here. But outside of having specific language, you could potentially allow for a tiny house village as a mobile home park or something like it. I don't have examples of those bylaws, but I don't know, Sue, do you?
No, I don't, but I'm sure we could do some research on that if, there was a need. Any more questions? Yeah, Paul.
Just wondering, I just like the thing about the tiny houses, it's kind of cool. It doesn't take up a lot of space and things like that. But I think one of the issues with that too is also have that infrastructure that we talked about before. You still have people living in them, so you still have water and sewer and electric and all these other things that go to them, and so I think that's
Right.
part of and when you mention the mobile home park, it just, you can hear the uproar about the community park, right? Already, and tiny houses, they look neat and everything, but I think that's part of the problem is getting over some of these personal objections with people, and that's really one of the things. And I was talking to someone else about trying to develop like small kind of manufacturing or type production businesses, or some more types of small scale sort of industry alongside of the housing, so that now there's also like a job creation, if you will, along with it, so that you don't have to. But I wonder how zoning might. You did mention mixed use, but I noticed most of that is like a commercial, a retail, or something like that. I don't see a lot of like workspace kind of things, or and how does zoning play into that as a plus or a negative?
Right. Those are all good questions, and communities just really need to look at their regulations and think about how they play out in real life, how they are actually implemented, and what they're looking to do. If they're looking to do something different like you're talking about, they probably need to make sure that the regulations allow that, which they probably don't.
Well, that's what I found so far. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure, because that's not a traditional thing that we, have considered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, if we don't have any more questions right now, I would like to, if we have just a few more minutes, call out to Sarah Lang, who offered to talk about a project or an effort that she's working on with the Village of Bellows Falls and an organization called the Incremental Development Alliance, and some strategies that they're taking to look at how to do more infill development and more small development within their village center. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, thanks. I'll be quick, and I'll mostly just throw a bunch of links into the chat for everyone to check out, because there's actually a ton of information which you don't want me to go over. We'll be here all night. And also John Dunbar is on the call. He on the Planning Commission in Rockingham, and also has participated since the beginning of the IncDev process. So I might, sort of choose him to say a few words. So we, our organization, along with a handful of others, provided funding for the town of Rockingham to hire the Incremental Development Alliance. And they essentially are a group of, they call themselves faculty of small developers and planning nerds, I guess, from around the country. And they come to your community, and they do sort of a twofold process. They work with the town to essentially do what you guys are talking about, looking at the regulations, seeing where the hurdles and the barriers are, and provide suggestions on ways to reduce those barriers for the small scale development that we all are begging for. And then on the other side of the process is really training and educating residents and community members on what it means to be a small scale developer. And I think just some points on that, I think we're all really used to just depending on like that big developer to come into town and put up whatever it is, whatever kind of development, and then leave. And traditionally, that's not how housing was built. Traditionally, it was, the banker, the farmer, the shoe salesman that also had a housing unit, was a landlord. That's how our communities were built, and that's just not the case anymore. And so, while I have an attentive audience, I really want to push for letting people know that it's all of our responsibilities to create more housing. We can't just wait for the Joe Schmo developer to come in and do it. Like, I need to consider about putting an ADU in my garage to add another housing unit. I need to, I think community members really need to pitch in where housing is involved. Otherwise, we'll never reach our quota, our need, to be honest, in our community. So I'll just say that. I do want to just put a link into the chat, which is where you can find all of the information that we worked on. And actually, we recorded all the presentations. So if anyone is interested in like the educational portion of it, and then there's also the reports and whatnot that they developed. And I think Jason was mentioning about non-conforming lots in in Bellows Falls. I think it's 46% of the lots are non-conforming, and so that in itself is just sort of an eye-opener. And I actually just want to call on John real quick. So we've also been doing a Strong Towns Academy course on housing, a group of some people from across Southern Vermont, and I'll put a link for that as well in the chat. I highly recommend it. It does cost money. They do group discounts, but it's just, they do such a good job of sort of like talking about this really big, messy, complex thing, and just like in the most simplest units, the most simplest descriptions, and they just do a really good job. And we're learning a ton, even though a lot of us know about housing already. It's they just do a great job. And the lesson that we did this week was on zoning, so very appropriate. And John actually facilitated that, and I just want to kind of call on him if he wants to say any words about that, because he put together some great information on it, and just anything you learned from that, John, would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Really, it reiterates a lot of what we talked about tonight, and that's what I found so helpful about being part of this discussion was, boy, it really supports the work that we're doing, and some of the studies that I've done just from a very small scale. As Sarah mentioned, I'm on the Planning Commission. I'm about 6 months into that service. I'm also a housing provider, and I'm going to steal that, Jason, because I think landlord is probably not the best term. And housing provider is certainly seems more noble. But I have, my twin brother and I own 14 units, over 4 buildings in Bellows Falls. And so when I started getting involved in the Planning Commission, I just did a quick study of how do our current dimensional regulations fit to what's actually in place on the ground. And it didn't take long to realize that nearly none of my buildings actually fit the current zoning. And so we were involved in, trying to rewrite some of the zoning bylaws and the dimensional regulations. And I think what I've found most helpful about tonight is that, as Jason said, if we're looking at 10,000 additional units in that area, small changes in dimensional regulations going from 30 feet to 20 feet or 10 feet to 5 feet, that's not going to do it. That's not going to allow us to make the huge changes. But eliminating barriers is going to be way more helpful than just lowering the height of the hurdle. So we need to take the hurdles out of the lane in order for big changes to happen. So, and that it's been great. I think a lot of my presentation last night, Sarah would probably say it matches a lot of the data that you guys are showing. So it's not, as Jason said, even though it's in Windsor County and some of those others, all of our towns have these issues.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I'll sort of end it here. And if you take a look at the incremental development stuff and you have questions, like, please just reach out, and happy to like talk offline about it. And the one last thing I'll say, I know this presentation is on zoning, but I guess a takeaway that I would want everyone to leave is that it's not just zoning. Just fixing your zoning is not going to solve the problem. I'm gonna put a link to I really like Strong Towns, if you can't tell. I'm gonna put a link to Strong Towns blog about, I believe it was Minnesota or Minneapolis, where they removed single family zoning. And there was only 3 permits for multifamily housing the year after they did that. So, just it really reiterates, like, it's a great first step, but there are so many other things that need to be fixed in order for us to get the housing we need. And so zoning is by far one of the biggest steps, but I think, just don't expect like all these multifamily housing units to like pop up just because you fixed your zoning. So it's a really great article. And again, they do such a good job of just sort of saying it in lay terms and, making it a really understandable topic. So I'll also put my email in if anyone wants to reach out and talk more.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, John. That was really interesting. And I agree that this is a very complex issue. From our earlier presentations, what we heard about the complexities of the financing, to the needs for infrastructure and the complexities of getting new infrastructure to our communities, to zoning regulations, and a whole array of issues surrounding this topic. We're just sort of starting to really figuring out what we need to do in our towns, how to make headway, and hopefully we'll make some progress. But as new topics arise, new questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. You can find us all online in our offices, and we hope to continue this discussion in the new year. And if there's no other questions at this point, I think we'll close it out for tonight, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for presenting.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.